Imagine a house at midnight, in the autumn of 1861. Every clock in the hallway has just been stopped. Not broken, stopped gently, on purpose, by a housemaid's hand, so that the last hour the master breathed will stay fixed on the clock face forever. Somewhere upstairs, a mirror is being turned to face the wall. Nobody in this house could tell you exactly why that's done. It's just done. It's what you do. You are the widow now. Hi, friends. Tonight we're settling in together for a slow, quiet story about a very particular kind of hardship. The hardship of being a wealthy woman in the Victorian era, the moment her husband stopped breathing. If you're just joining me, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders. Let your body sink into the mattress like it's finally allowed to rest. I'd love to know, in the comments, whenever you wake up and read them, where are you tucked in tonight, and what time is it where you are? There's something nice about knowing this little story is drifting out across so many different bedrooms, so many different time zones, all at once. And if you're enjoying this kind of slow, sleepy history, only if you feel like it, no pressure at all. A quiet like or a subscribe helps this little channel keep going. But that's a thought for tomorrow. Tonight is just for resting, so let's ease into it. Let's go back to a candlelit hallway in Victorian England, to a woman standing very still in a doorway, wearing a dress the color of the night outside the window. And let's find out why, even with a fortune sitting in the bank, her life was about to become smaller, heavier, and far lonelier than anyone had bothered to warn her. Picture her hands first. Cold, because no one has thought to build up the fire. The household is in shock. Her fingers are resting on the doorframe as if the wood itself might hold her upright. She has money, perhaps a great deal of it. Her husband was a mill owner, or a solicitor, or a man with land in 3 counties. There is a bank account with 4 figures in it, maybe 5. And none of that will save her from what is about to happen over the next 24 hours, the next 2 years, possibly the rest of her life. Because in Victorian England, when a wealthy man died, the first thing that happened to his widow wasn't comfort. It was rules. You can almost hear the house settle into its new silences. The creak of a floorboard upstairs, a dog somewhere whining low in its throat, sensing something has changed before it understands what. Outside, the wind moves through bare October branches, a soft dry rattle, like the trees themselves are exhaling, within hours, a maid or a female relative, never the widow herself, that would be considered undignified, would begin gathering black fabric, curtains, ideally already in the house, because a well-run household of means was expected to keep black mourning drapery on hand, the way you might keep spare linens. If not, a servant would be sent out immediately, sometimes that very night, to purchase yards of black crepe from a draper's shop that, in a well-to-do neighborhood, likely kept extra stock precisely because deaths were common enough to be predictable business. Every mirror in the house gets covered or turned. The superstition ran that a soul, newly loose from its body, might get trapped inside a mirror's reflection if it caught sight of itself on the way out. Nobody in 1861 could tell you where exactly this belief came from. It simply was. Grief, it turns out, doesn't need a footnote to feel true. The clocks, too. Every clock in a house of mourning would be stopped at the hour of death, and left that way sometimes for days, sometimes, in the most sentimental homes, until the funeral itself. Imagine living inside a house where time has visibly, physically halted, where every room you walk through shows you the exact same frozen minute. There's something almost soothing in that thought now. Tonight, from this distance, a house pausing itself out of respect. But imagine living inside it. Every hour of your actual day spent walking past a clock, telling you it is still that hour. Still that same terrible hour. You'd hear softly from somewhere below the front door opening and closing, as neighbors and relatives arrived to pay respects. Their boots quiet, on the stone step, their voices dropped instinctively low. The way voices always seem to lower themselves near a house of death, as if grief were something that could be startled off like a bird. And upstairs, in a room with the curtains already drawn, A woman who an hour ago was simply a wife was now, without her consent, without so much as a conversation, a widow. Capital W, a social category, a costume she would be expected to wear, quite literally, for years. Here is where the money, the fortune, the land, the name, starts to matter less than you'd think. Because a rich widow in Victorian England didn't get to grieve quietly in her own way, at her own pace, in her own clothes. She got to grieve according to an enormous, unspoken, extremely specific rulebook that dictated what she wore, where she went, who she spoke to, how loudly she was allowed to laugh, and for how many months she was required to keep doing all of this before society would even consider her recovered. It's almost funny if you let yourself think about it slowly enough. Tonight, safe under your blankets. All that money, and none of it could buy her out of 2 solid years of a very specific black dress code. Wealth bought better fabric. It did not buy freedom. The dress itself, we'll get into this properly in a little while, don't worry, we have all night, was made of a fabric called crepe, a stiff, dull, scratchy black silk gauze that had been chemically treated to lose all its shine, because shine in mourning was considered almost obscene. A grieving woman was not meant to glow. She was meant to absorb light, not reflect it, and that fabric, stiff as cardboard in places, would rub against a widow's wrists and neck for months. Some accounts from the era describe rashes. Skin left raw and pink beneath the black. There's a kind of dry irony in that, isn't there? Society demanding that your suffering be visible on the outside, and then handing you a fabric that made sure it also hurt on the inside, quite literally, against your own skin. Let's slow down here, together, and just sit with her for a moment. Because before we walk through the wardrobe, and the etiquette books, and the years of restriction that followed, I want you to picture her simply standing at the window, in that first dark night, watching the last carriage of visitors pull away down the gravel drive, the crunch of wheels fading into the dark. She doesn't know it yet, but the woman who steps away from that window tonight will not be allowed to fully exist in public again, not as herself, not as anyone recognizable, for at least 2 years, maybe longer if certain relatives have opinions, and they will. Somewhere in the house, a clock that no longer moves sits frozen at the hour her husband died, and somewhere inside her, something has frozen too, though she doesn't have words for it yet, and won't, not for a long while. Rich, yes. Comfortable, yes, in the sense that she will not go hungry, will not lose the house, will not have to work with her hands the way a poorer widow would, but free. Not yet, not for a long, long time. Downstairs, somewhere in the kitchen, a cook who has served this family for 11 years is quietly setting aside black-bordered notepaper that arrived, oddly, already in the house, kept in a drawer for exactly this purpose, the way a well-run household kept spare candles or extra coal. Death in Victorian England was common enough, frequent enough, that a family of means simply planned for it in advance, the same practical way they planned for a hard winter. There's something almost comforting in that thought, tonight, from this great distance of years. A house quietly prepared, in its own way, to hold its people through the worst of it. And somewhere else, in the house, a young housemaid, perhaps 16, perhaps 17, is carefully covering the last uncovered mirror in the downstairs parlor, working by a single candle, because gas has not yet been lit in that room tonight. Her hands move quickly but gently, the black cloth settling over gilded glass like a held breath. She has done this twice before, for other households in the neighborhood, and she already knows, without being told, exactly how long the fabric needs to stay, exactly which corners tend to slip loose overnight if they aren't pinned properly. Grief, for her, is simply part of the job, practiced, familiar, quietly skillful, even if never spoken of that way, still standing, still at the window, still, for now, simply a woman who has lost someone, before the rules arrive to tell her exactly how she's allowed to carry that loss. Imagine for a moment that grief had a uniform, not a metaphorical one, an actual, tailored, itchy, physically uncomfortable uniform that you were required to wear, every single day, for a length of time measured not in weeks but in years. That was, quite literally, what awaited a Victorian widow once the first shock of loss had passed. and the practical business of mourning began. Settle back in, friends. We're still here, still drifting through this slow story together. If you've just joined partway through, that's all right. This kind of tale doesn't need to be caught from the start to feel soothing. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. We're simply going to keep walking gently through the strange rules of a life long past. The dress itself came first, and it came fast. Within a day or two of the funeral, a wealthy widow would typically be visited, sometimes summoned, more accurately, by a mourning warehouse's dressmaker, or her order would be sent to one of the large specialty shops that existed purely to outfit the grieving. Places with names that sound almost gentle now, like little shops for sorrow, stocked floor to ceiling with nothing but black. And here's a detail worth sitting with for a moment. These shops did booming business. Mourning was, in the strictest financial sense, an industry. A death in a wealthy family meant new dresses, new bonnets, new gloves, new jewelry, new stationery edged in black ink, new handkerchiefs hemmed in black thread. Somewhere, a shopkeeper was doing quite well out of her loss. There's a small, dry irony folded into that, isn't there? The very depth of a woman's sorrow could be measured, quite literally, by how much she was made to spend proving it. The primary fabric was crepe, sometimes spelled crepe in the old style, and it deserves its own careful description, because this fabric shaped a widow's physical experience of grief more than almost anything else in her day. Crepe was silk, but silk that had been treated to remove its natural sheen, leaving it dull, matte, almost chalky in appearance. It was also, crucially, stiff, not soft and flowing like ordinary silk. Crepe held its shape almost like paper, with a slightly crimped, crinkled texture. Picture the sound of it, a low, dry, whispering rustle with every step, every turn of the head, every lift of an arm. Some accounts of the period describe it almost like the sound of dry leaves, faint and constant, following a widow through every room she entered. Against warm skin, especially in humid weather, that stiff crepe could be genuinely unpleasant. It didn't breathe the way ordinary cotton or lighter silk did. Wrists, necks, the insides of elbows, all the places where fabric meets skin most closely, could become irritated, even raw, over weeks of constant wear. Add to this the fact that many mourning dyes of the period were unstable and could run, especially in rain or sweat, sometimes leaving a faint gray-black tint on the skin beneath. Imagine that, grief, quite literally rubbing off on you, staining the very body it was meant to honor. And she wore this, in Victorian England's strictest interpretation of deep mourning, for a full year and a day at minimum, sometimes stretched to 2 full years, depending on the family and how devoted, or how watched, the widow was. Let's slow the pace here and really sit inside what that meant. Day to day, hour to hour, every single morning, for 2 years a wealthy widow would rise and dress in black. Not once in a while, every day. Breakfast in black, a walk in the garden in black, sitting by the fire reading letters in black. Even her undergarments, in the strictest households, were expected to shift toward black or deep gray, though this was less rigidly enforced, simply because no one but her lady's maid would ever see them. Her jewelry changed too. Gold was considered far too bright, too celebratory, too alive for deep mourning. In its place came something called jet, a hard, black, fossilized form of ancient wood, mined primarily from the cliffs near a town called Whitby on the English coast. Jet could be carved and polished to a soft, deep black shine, and it became, almost overnight, one of the most fashionable and requested materials in the country, purely because Queen Victoria herself wore it after her own husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861. Here's a small, gentle piece of trivia worth turning over slowly in your mind before sleep. Queen Victoria wore black mourning for the rest of her life after Albert's death, for 40 years, and in doing so, she essentially set the fashion, the etiquette, the emotional expectation for every wealthy widow in the country who followed her example, whether they wanted to or not. One woman's very private, very long grief became an entire nation's dress code. That's a strange kind of power and a strange kind of burden, both at once. Whitby jet workshops apparently could barely keep up with demand in the years after Albert's death. Imagine the scene. Dozens of small workshops along a windswept coastal town, carving brooches and beads and long mourning necklaces out of ancient black stone, day and night, simply to keep pace with a nation's fashionable sorrow. A widow's jewelry, then, in her first year, might consist of a jet brooch, perhaps containing a small woven curl of her husband's hair pressed under glass, an actual, physical piece of him kept close against her chest every day. Hair jewelry was remarkably common in this era, and while it can sound unsettling to modern ears, in context it was tender, almost achingly so. A way of keeping someone physically near when nothing else of them remained. The bonnet deserves a slow mention of its own. A widow's bonnet in deep mourning came with a long black veil, sometimes made of the same stiff crepe as her dress, that could be worn down over the face for the first months, genuinely obscuring her features from the world, as though grief itself required a kind of camouflage. Lifting that veil, for the first time in public, was considered a small social event in itself, a signal, without words, that a widow was easing, slightly, out of the deepest phase of her mourning. Imagine the physical experience of that veil. Thick black fabric, close to the face, filtering sunlight into a dim grey wash. Her own breath, warm, caught just in front of her mouth. The whole world seen through a soft dark scrim, as though she were watching her own life from one careful step removed. Some widows, later in life, described a strange kind of comfort in this, the veil as a shield, a permission to not perform an expression for anyone, to simply exist behind the fabric, unseen and unbothered, at least for a little while. But it must have been stifling too, in the literal sense. Warm months, thick veiling, limited air. More than one etiquette guide of the period gently acknowledged that veils could cause headaches, dizziness, even fainting in the heat. Grief, apparently, was expected to be endured even at some real cost to a widow's physical comfort. There's that dry little irony again, isn't there, tucked so calmly into these customs. A society deeply concerned with the appearance of feeling, sometimes rather less concerned with the actual body doing the feeling. After roughly a year in deep mourning, a wealthy widow might transition into what was called second mourning, still black, but now permitted slightly less severe fabrics, a little more trim, perhaps a small amount of matte black silk instead of crepe. The veil could be worn back, off the face, rather than down. Only after this, often close to 2 full years from the death, could she move into half mourning. This was the gentlest phase, and it introduced a very specific, very limited palette. Soft grey, muted mauve, deep lilac, sometimes a touch of white at the collar or cuffs. Not color, exactly. More like the suggestion of color, filtered through several layers of restraint. You can imagine how strange it must have felt, that first morning she was permitted to wear grey instead of black. A small shift, and yet, after 2 years of deep, matte darkness, even that pale lilac trim might have felt almost startlingly bright against her skin, like sunlight after a long illness indoors. And through every stage of this, deep mourning, second mourning, half mourning, a wealthy widow's fortune bought her nothing but better fabric. Softer crepe, perhaps. Finer jet, more elegantly carved. A dressmaker who came to the house rather than requiring her to visit the shop. But the rules themselves, the duration, the colors, the veil, the restrictions, applied just as rigidly to her as to a widow with far less money. Grief, in Victorian England, was one of the very few things that money could dress up beautifully, but could not shorten and could not soften. Somewhere, in a wardrobe upstairs, dresses in black, then grey, then lilac, hung in careful order, a kind of calendar made of cloth, marking time not in months on a page but in fabric against skin. There's a small, gentle absurdity worth noticing here too, the kind that might make you smile softly into your pillow rather than laugh out loud. Etiquette manuals of the period devoted genuine, serious ink to questions like exactly how many inches of crepe trim were appropriate on a second mourning bonnet, or whether jet buttons were acceptable before the 6-month mark or only after. Grown women, capable of running estates and raising children and managing household budgets larger than most men's annual salaries, were nonetheless expected to consult printed guides for permission on the precise millimeter at which their sorrow was allowed to lighten. It's the kind of detail that, viewed from a cozy distance of over a century and from the safety of your own soft bed tonight, starts to feel almost gently comic. All that seriousness poured into the exact width of a ribbon, still dressed for sorrow, still counting quietly the months, still hers to endure, whether she felt it that deeply or not. Imagine being invited somewhere and having to say no, not because you didn't want to go, but because a small unwritten rule book, memorized by every hostess in the county, told you it wasn't your turn yet. That was the quiet, constant reality of a wealthy Victorian widow's social life. Not loneliness imposed by circumstance, loneliness imposed by etiquette, on purpose. As a kind of test of her devotion to the husband she'd lost. Read a little deeper now, if you can. We're past the midpoint of tonight's story, easing gently toward the later softer parts. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Just let the images drift past you, like watching lantern light move along a dark hallway wall. In the first weeks of deep mourning, a wealthy widow was expected to withdraw almost entirely. No dinner parties, no dances, obviously. Dancing was considered one of the most inappropriate things a grieving woman could do, a visible display of joy and physical lightness that clashed violently with the solemnity she was meant to embody. No theater, no concerts, except perhaps sacred music, performed quietly, attended briefly. Even receiving visitors at home followed careful rules. In the earliest days, only close family and a small number of intimate friends would call, and even then, visits were expected to be brief. A quiet sitting, low voices, tea perhaps, and then a gentle, unhurried departure. It was considered poor form to stay too long, to laugh too loudly, or, and this one is oddly specific, to bring up any topic that might make the widow smile too freely. Grief was to be respected by keeping the room, quite literally, dim in mood as well as in light. There's a small dry irony worth noticing here, gently, without judgment. An entire social class built its reputation on knowing precisely the correct way to behave around sadness, and yet so much of that correct behavior amounted to simply making the room feel heavier. Comfort, oddly, was rarely the goal. Correctness was. As months passed, a widow could gradually resume some social contact. But always according to a hierarchy nobody had to explain twice, because everybody's mother had drilled it into them since childhood. She could receive close friends before she could attend a dinner. She could attend a very small, quiet dinner before she could appear at a larger gathering. She could appear briefly at a larger gathering months before she could ever be seen dancing, and she absolutely could not consider remarriage, not even the faintest social hint of it, until a minimum of 1 full year had passed, and often longer if her husband's family had strong feelings on the matter. Which, more often than not, they did. Picture a summer garden party, string music drifting faintly across a lawn, the soft clink of teacups, laughter carried on a light breeze, and a widow, 6 months into her mourning, standing at the edge of it all in her deep black dress, permitted to be present, expected to remain visibly separate. Not because anyone disliked her, simply because the rules said so, and everyone, including her, had absorbed those rules so thoroughly since childhood that questioning them would have felt almost as strange as questioning gravity. There's something quietly heartbreaking in that image, and something quietly funny too, in the way only very old, very rigid social customs can be funny from a safe distance of over a century. A woman standing near, but never quite inside, her own social world, dressed head to toe as a walking announcement of her unavailability, while the party continued gently on without her, string music drifting, teacups clinking, life simply carrying on a few feet away. Calling cards played their own small, strange role here. Wealthy Victorian women exchanged printed visiting cards constantly, a whole silent language of who had called on whom, whose visit had been returned, whose hadn't. A widow's cards during deep mourning were bordered in black, a thick black line running the entire edge of the card, sometimes so wide it left barely enough white space to fit her printed name. As her mourning progressed through its stages, that black border would gradually narrow. A thinner border meant a widow further along in her grief. Guests receiving her card could quite literally measure the width of black ink and know instantly how many months had passed since her husband died, without exchanging a single word. Imagine that for a moment, your grief, measured in millimeters of ink, printed and mailed to acquaintances, a silent little report card of sorrow that everyone in polite society knew how to read at a glance. Correspondence followed similar rules. Writing paper for a widow in deep mourning came pre-printed with a thick black border, and again that border would slowly, gradually thin across the following months and years, tracking her progress through grief the way a ruler tracks inches. Ink, too. Some households insisted on black-bordered stationery paired specifically with black ink, never the ordinary blue-black many households use day to day, as though even the tools of writing needed to visibly mourn alongside her. Remarriage, and we'll speak of this gently, because it carried real weight for many women, was its own particular minefield. A widow, even a wealthy one with land and income entirely her own, faced enormous social pressure regarding how soon she could even be seen speaking warmly with another man, let alone consider marrying again. A year was often considered the earliest acceptable point to even quietly entertain the idea, and even then, remarrying too soon, which could mean anything under 2 years, depending entirely on how strict her particular social circle happened to be, risked whispered judgment that she hadn't loved her first husband deeply enough, that her grief had been performance rather than truth. And yet, here's a strange little contradiction worth sitting with. A widow who never remarried at all, who stayed in black or half-mourning colors for the rest of her life, the way Queen Victoria famously did, was often held up as the ideal, the ultimate expression of devoted love. So a wealthy widow found herself gently, quietly caught, praised for staying alone forever, but also softly pressured, especially if she had no children or her husband's family wanted the estate settled, to remarry sensibly and swiftly. There was no version of this that fully satisfied everyone watching, and everyone, it seemed, was always watching. It's worth pausing here, gently, to notice something true and a little sad underneath all this ritual. Much of it wasn't really about her grief at all. It was about being seen to grieve correctly. Whether she cried every night alone in her room, or felt strangely calm, or even, and this happened more than etiquette books like to admit, felt a private, guilty sense of relief if the marriage had been an unhappy one, none of that interior truth mattered nearly as much as the black border on her stationery, the width of her veil, the number of months since the funeral. Her money bought her a large house to be lonely in. It bought her fine crepe instead of rough. It did not buy her permission to simply feel whatever she actually felt, at her own pace, in her own way. There was one more layer to all this watching, a quieter one, that rarely made it into the etiquette manuals, but sat underneath every one of their careful rules just the same. The simple fact that a widow's behavior was never entirely her own private business. It belonged, in a sense, to everyone around her. Her mother-in-law had opinions about the width of her veil. Her own sisters had opinions about how soon she returned to church. Neighbors, quite genuinely fond of her, still found themselves quietly noting how many months had passed since the funeral compared to how relaxed her posture seemed at the last garden party, as though grief and posture were meant to move at exactly the same measured pace. Picture the low murmur of it, never cruel, rarely even unkind, just constant. A soft hum of observation running underneath every social gathering she attended, every letter she wrote, every dress fitting she sat through, not unlike the sound of rain on a window at night. You stop consciously noticing it after a while, but some small part of you never quite stops listening for it either. And here is the small, quiet mercy tucked inside all of it, if you look closely enough. Most of these women survived the watching. They wrote their letters, wore their black-bordered stationery, sat through their garden parties at the edges of the lawn, and eventually, season by season, the watching softened, as watching tends to, once enough time has passed, and enough new small dramas have arrived to occupy the neighborhood's attention instead. Still watched for a while. still measured for a while, in inches of black ink and months on a calendar, but not forever, never quite forever. Imagine spending years married to a man, running his household, raising his children, managing servants and accounts, and the thousand small invisible tasks that keep a large home functioning. And then, the moment he dies, discovering that a good portion of what you thought was simply yours was never quite yours to begin with. This is the part of the story that tends to surprise people most. So, let's take it slowly, the way we've taken everything else tonight. There's no rush. The night is long, and we have plenty of it left. Under English law, through most of the Victorian era, a married woman's legal identity was, in a very real sense, folded into her husband's. This principle had an old legal name, coverture, and under it, a wife generally couldn't independently own property, sign contracts in her own name, or control her own earnings while her husband was alive. Whatever money or land she'd brought into the marriage, whatever she inherited during it, typically became her husband's to manage and control. Here's where it gets interesting. And a little more hopeful, though only slightly. Widowhood actually restored a woman's legal independence in many respects. As a widow, she was legally treated as what was called a feme sole, literally, a single woman, meaning she could once again own property in her own name, sign contracts, run a business, manage her own finances, without needing a husband's or male relative's signature attached to everything. So, in one narrow technical sense, widowhood gave a wealthy Victorian woman more legal autonomy than she'd had as a wife. That's worth sitting with for a moment, quietly, because it's genuinely a strange and slightly uncomfortable truth. Losing her husband, in the eyes of the law, made her more independent than being married to him ever had. But, and here's where the real difficulty crept in, that legal independence didn't always translate into practical, comfortable, secure control over her own life, because what she actually inherited, and how much control she had over it, depended enormously on what her husband's will said, what marriage settlements had been arranged years earlier, often before she'd even fully understood what she was agreeing to, and how cooperative or difficult her husband's family chose to be afterward. Many wealthy marriages of the period involved what were called marriage settlements. Legal arrangements, drawn up before the wedding, usually by the bride's father working with lawyers, that were meant to protect a portion of her money, specifically for her and any children, keeping it somewhat separate from her husband's control and his family's reach. These settlements, when they existed and were well drafted, could be a genuine lifeline for a widow, guaranteeing her a fixed income, sometimes called a jointure, that continued after her husband's death, regardless of what else happened to the estate. But not every woman had a father wealthy, or careful enough to insist on strong settlements, and even with a settlement in place, a widow often found herself financially secure, but not necessarily in control. It was extremely common for a deceased husband's will to leave his widow an income for life, enough to live comfortably, sometimes very comfortably, while placing the actual capital, the underlying property and investments themselves, in trust, managed by trustees who were usually male relatives, family solicitors, or old friends of her late husband. Picture that arrangement for a moment. A wealthy widow, living in a fine house, wearing good jewelry, employing a full staff, and every quarter a check or an allowance arrives from trustees who control the actual money, who she must, in practice, ask permission from for anything beyond her regular income. Want to sell a piece of land? Ask the trustees. Want to make a large investment, or help a struggling relative, or fund something meaningful to her personally? Ask the trustees. She's comfortable. She's provided for. She is, in many meaningful daily ways, still not entirely free. There's a dry, quiet irony worth noticing here too. A legal system supposedly built, in part, to protect widows from financial ruin often ended up protecting the money from the widow instead, assuming, gently but firmly, that a woman, even a grown, capable, grieving adult who had run an entire household for decades, still needed a man or two looking over her financial shoulder. If she had sons, particularly an eldest son, matters could grow more complicated still. under a common inheritance practice called primogeniture, favored heavily among landed families. The bulk of an estate, especially land and the family home itself, often passed directly to the eldest son upon his father's death, not to the widow. She might retain a right to live in a portion of the house, or in a separate smaller property, under an arrangement sometimes called her dower, an old legal term for a widow's guaranteed share of her husband's estate. But the family seat, the land, the name on the deed, frequently belonged now to her own son. Imagine the strange, quiet reversal in that. A woman who had run a great house for 20-30 years, now living in it, if she was allowed to remain at all, somewhat as a guest in what had functionally been her domain for decades. Some widows navigated all of this with remarkable skill. History remembers a fair number of Victorian widows who took over their husbands' businesses entirely, breweries, publishing houses, shipping firms, and ran them with real success, precisely because widowhood had, ironically, granted them the legal standing a wife simply hadn't had. There's something quietly admirable in that, worth resting on for a moment before we move toward tonight's close. Within an unfair, complicated system, plenty of these women found real, tangible ways to build competence and independence that the world hadn't expected to allow them. But even for the most capable, most financially comfortable widow, there was a particular, persistent kind of tiredness in it all. The tiredness of always slightly having to prove herself. Of trustees who might second-guess her decisions purely because she was a widow rather than because her judgment was actually poor. Of in-laws who might quietly suggest she remarry soon, not out of concern for her happiness, but because a new husband would once again take the financial burden and financial control off the family's collective hands. Money, then, bought her comfort. It bought her a soft bed, a full larder, servants to manage the physical labor of the house. It did not, in most cases, buy her the simple, quiet dignity of being fully trusted, without question, with what was, by every reasonable measure, already hers, still capable, still, in her own quiet way, holding the household together, still so often having to ask. And so we come, gently, to the end of her story tonight. Not because her life ended here, but because our slow little visit with her does. She likely lived on for years after this particular version of her. The deep mourning gradually lifting into gray, then lilac, then, eventually, whatever colors she chose for herself again, in her own time, on her own terms, as much as the world of her era allowed. Some of these women remarried, quietly, happily, years later. Some never did, and found in that solitude a kind of peace, or at least a kind of steadiness that suited them. Some took up their husbands' businesses and ran them well into old age. Some simply lived, day by day, in the big quiet house, the clocks running again, the mirrors uncovered, the black slowly folded away into trunks in the attic, kept, some of it, for the next funeral that would inevitably come. Because in a world without modern medicine, funerals came often, and mourning wardrobes were, sadly, rarely used only once. Let your breathing slow now, if it hasn't already. Let the story settle around you like the last dying light of a fire. Embers glowing low and orange, no longer needing tending, simply resting on their own warmth. Somewhere, in a quiet upstairs room, in a house that no longer exists, a clock that was once stopped is, in this imagining, gently ticking again. Soft, steady, unhurried. Let's linger just a little longer before we let her go for the night, because there's one more small, quiet truth worth resting on. For every widow whose story survived, recorded in a will, a letter, a ledger, a newspaper notice of a business she took over, there were countless more whose names simply faded, unremarked, into parish records and family Bibles. Women who lived out their half-mourning years and their full-color years alike in ordinary, unremarkable comfort, tending gardens, raising grandchildren, writing letters to sisters in other counties, growing gently older by the same fire, season after season. We don't know most of their names. We know the shape of their days instead, the black-bordered stationery slowly thinning in the writing desk drawer, the crepe dresses eventually packed away in cedar chests, the jet jewelry passed down, a generation later, to a granddaughter who would wear it not out of grief, but simply because it was beautiful and old and hers. There's something gentle in that thought, that even rules as rigid and heavy as these eventually soften with time, the way all customs do, the way this one did too, fading slowly across the turn of a new century until veils grew shorter and mourning periods grew shorter, and eventually, quietly, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the whole elaborate architecture of Victorian grief simply stopped being built new and became, instead, a story. The kind you might tell someone gently, late at night, to help them drift off to sleep. Picture, one last time, the fire burning low in the grate, the shawl still folded over the arm of the chair, the window holding just a thin seam of moonlight along its sill. The house is quiet now. Not the frightened, held-breath quiet of that very first night, but a different kind of quiet, settled, familiar, earned. The kind of quiet a house only reaches after a great many ordinary days have simply been allowed to happen inside it, one after another, undisturbed. She is somewhere in that house tonight, in this gentle imagining of her, older now, softer around the eyes, dressed in whatever color she likes. Not a widow anymore, not only that. Simply a woman at rest in a home that is, in every quiet way that finally matters, entirely her own, still hers, still home. Still, at long last, quietly, gently, enough, Sleeswell friends. Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, rest now still, quiet enough.